mountains of selfishness and doubt, but you say by faith that you can move them now. So I am on the altar, laying down my life. Come wash me with your water.
All right. Good evening. I appreciate you being here. We're still figuring out all the settings. This is the first time, obviously, we've done a Wednesday night up here, and so we don't know where all the light switches are, and we're going to figure that out. If you were here Sunday morning, this room, theoretically, with more chairs, will hold about 400 people. We had 179 or 180 on Sunday morning. So first time we open up the venue and it is about half full. So I'm not sure what that means, but it means we got to get more space, right? So if it's not bright enough, you can let me know later, and we'll continue to tinker. Every event that we hold here has different settings depending on what they're trying to do with that event. And right now the stage is not real bright, but see this black right here, this is a video wall. And I could blind all of you if we turned it on and turned it up. It's pretty powerful. But let's see if we can manage this. You know, one of the best parts about changing locations is none of you all know where to sit. And I saw you come in and just be paralyzed at the back door, not knowing which way to go. So I also know that it is human nature, and that after one time you will have established your new normal and you'll know right where to sit. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm teaching from the 11th chapter of Hebrews, and we saw the first lesson was we looked at the life of Abel and then the life of Enoch. The last time I taught, we were looking at the life of Noah. This evening, we're going to turn our attention to Abraham. Abraham has the highest number of verses. I'm a little bit too strong, fellas. Abraham has the highest number of verses devoted to a single person in Hebrews chapter 11. But that is not inappropriate, because biblically speaking, Abraham is the composite of God's pattern of faith. In other words, he's the most complete example given to us of faith in the entire Old Testament. So when you look at the number of verses in the Old Testament dedicated to Abraham, really the only other character that even begins to approach that would be Moses. Next might be David, but there's quite a gap there. And so it's appropriate that Abraham and Moses turn out to be the ones who get the most coverage in Hebrews chapter 11. So I want us to look at these verses, and then we'll talk about the life of Abraham, and we'll throw Sarah in there as well. You've got a pretty simple outline that I provided for you. The author is going to turn his attention to the lives of the patriarchs. So we'll look at Abraham tonight. Next Wednesday night, let me encourage you to be here. Our new pastor for adults, Roger Brumley. No, not next week. I'm going to teach next week. 2 weeks from tonight, Roger is going to teach while I'm in South Korea. And so you'll want to hear him and get to know him a little bit better. But we're going to, over the next several weeks of this study, we'll be in the patriarchs. We have Abraham, and then we'll do Isaac and Jacob in coming weeks as this chapter continues to unfold. So open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to pick up with verse 8, which is we left off at the end of verse 7. Verse 8 says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he left, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, even from one man, and one who was as good as dead at that, there were born descendants who were just as the stars of heaven in number and as the innumerable grains of sand along the seashore. Now there's a parenthesis that begins with verse 13. So we're going to skip verses 13 through 16, drop down to verse 17. We pick up the story. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and the one who had received the promises was offering up his only son. It was he to whom it was said, through Isaac your descendants shall be named. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. All right, that's the next 4 lessons. We're going to see Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph. All right? Now, look at the story of Abraham. Verse 8 tells us that Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he left, not knowing where he was going. I've called that confident obedience. It is the obedience of the pilgrimage. Abraham was contacted by God. How that whole story unfolded, we don't know. Abraham was of pagan roots, living in a pagan part of the world, and yet there was something that God saw in him, and God found him and offered him a covenant. The covenant would involve a lifetime of separation from the world, but it saw Abraham respond in absolute and instant obedience. Open your Bibles. We're gonna go back and forth. So Mark Hebrews chapter 11, and then go back to Genesis chapter 12, because that's where the story comes in. And in verse 8, where the writer of Hebrews is putting Abraham on display, because he says when he was called, he obeyed. And this is a great phrase, by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he left, not knowing where he was going. Now that's pretty fascinating. Let's read the actual story. Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram went away as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now let's talk about this story, because one of the lessons that comes from the life of Abraham, one of the things that I've tried to look at as I've worked my own way through Hebrews chapter 11, is I wanted to identify, we know that faith is the common thread of each of these characters. But what is it? What was the specific instance of faith that put these heroes on the radar of the inspired author of Hebrews to acknowledge that these are the people that we look to? One of the things that I'm convinced by comparing Hebrews 11:8 and these 4 verses in the first part of Genesis chapter 12 is something that I had never considered before. Oftentimes I have people come to me and they'll ask for advice, or they really want a sounding board. They have a decision that they're trying to make, and they're trying to weigh all their options. And usually when we try and make decisions, it has to do with weighing the pros and the cons, and sort of measuring the benefits, the cost-benefit analysis, we call it. But what I discovered in really contemplating the story of Abraham is that really God's direction is the only roadmap that we're ever given in Scripture that we can have with confidence. It's not the idea of lots of equally valid options that we can look at. There is, but I want to clarify this. Let me see if I can get my arms wrapped around it in a way that I can help you understand. The confusion when we're trying to follow God, there are two primary mistakes that I see people making. The first mistake is the idea that if I mess up this decision, my whole life is destroyed. The fact of the matter is, the sovereignty of God teaches us that God is going to get each one of us to the conclusion that He has established for us. Sometimes you need to take a breath and relax, because you are not going to ultimately do something to frustrate the will of God unfolding in your life. Now, just like the old Fram oil filter commercials, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. I mean, we can make decisions that make our path to God's plan for us more difficult on us than it has to be. But I've just seen people get an ulcer because they're afraid they're gonna frustrate the will of God. Listen, here's the other part of that you need to understand. The will of God for your life is for you to be like Jesus Christ. He guarantees that He's going to accomplish what He's already started in you. Now, having said that, we get bent out of shape because we think the will of God has to do with specific options. Like if I take this job, but I don't take that job, I could potentially derail the whole course of my life. Now, I don't think that's the way the will of God works. I think whatever job you take, God's going to use that as a platform, and He's going to use what you experience in that job as part of what He does to shape you and to develop you. Because remember, it really doesn't matter to God that much whether you work for company A or company B. His plan is to make you like Christ. Everything revolves around that. So it's not that all choices are equal and it doesn't matter what you choose, but I think we can get too bent out of shape thinking that we can make a decision that's going to derail our lives and God's not going to be able to use us. That's a failure to acknowledge the sovereignty of God. Now, the time that is no longer applies is what we have here in Abraham's example. When God comes to Abraham and gives him a specific instruction. You see, God didn't tell me whether I should work for company A or company B. Sometimes when somebody lays out their choices to me, I say, well, what do you want to do? I mean, which one is more attractive to you? Which one are you naturally drawn to? If God doesn't give us specific instructions, then like a good father, a lot of times I think God is just saying, we're going to get to where we're going together, so pick your path. My dad never took me to Brahms to get ice cream and told me what flavor I had to have. Every time I went to Brahms, he said, I'm going to buy you ice cream. What do you want? I think God as a father does that for us many times. I'm a good father. I'm going to take care of how this story unfolds. But of these options in front of you, what do you want? Now, that doesn't hold true in those rare instances where God calls you to a specific thing. When it was time to start Evergreen, I had no shortage of options I had churches that had sent their pastor search committees to talk to me. I had a teaching position that was available. I had lots of options. And yet God said, this one, do this. God gives us choices, and we don't have to get an ulcer over making a decision when he allows us to have those choices. But in Abraham's case, he didn't say, listen, just migrate in this direction, and wherever you end up, we'll figure it out as we go along. No, in this instance, there's actually a moment where it says, go from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. In other words, God had a specific destination, which means that following God is the only roadmap that would get Abraham to where he needed to be. Now, the call is really, there are progressive levels of commitment here. He says, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house. He's to leave his land, his relatives, and his father's house, an ever-increasing level of sacrifice. But he says, I will make you, I'm going to take you to the land which I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be a blessing. Now, it's interesting. These are the promises. The command comes first, and the promises come second. That's also something significant. Our temptation sometimes is when God says, I want you to do something, our response is, how's that going to turn out? We think God should give us the promise first, and then we'll decide to follow. That's not his pattern. His pattern is, he says, this is what I want from you. And oh, by the way, with your obedience, now there's this. Obedience precedes promise. But in this instance, the promise more than makes up for the sacrifice. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your relatives. I want you to leave your father's house. But here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. Now, it's interesting. These are increasing levels of promise that go with the increasing levels of sacrifice. The sacrifice is answered in verse 2 because he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. That is, I'm going to turn you into an entire nation that doesn't yet exist. I'm going to bless you. And then this phrase we don't understand often. He says, I will make your name great. Now think about that. We think, because we're in such a celebrity-driven culture, make your name great. When we read that, we hear famous. God was not saying, I'm going to make you a celebrity. You're not going to be able to go anywhere without being recognized. Everybody's going to know who you are. That's not what that means. I will make your name great does not mean I will make you famous. In Hebrew, I will make your name great means, because remember, in Hebrew culture, the name was a reflection of the character. That's why so often in the Old Testament, when there was a life-changing encounter with God, it was often accompanied by a name change. Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, becomes Israel. He changes his name because he met God, and the change in his character was dramatic. When God says, I'm going to make you a mighty nation, wow, that's impressive. That by itself would have been enough to say, yeah, I'm in. Take me wherever you want me to go. He said, I'm going to bless you. Okay, that's something else. God, the God who created the universe, is saying to Abraham, I am going to personally oversee your story. I'm going to be the one responsible for blessing you. Wow. And then he doesn't stop there. He says, I'm going to make your name great. In other words, I'm going to create in you a character of such quality that people will recognize that something supernatural has taken place in your life. Well, he goes on from there. The command is in verse 1, the promises are in verse 2, But the promises continue in verse 3 as they begin to expand out beyond Abraham. Everything in verse 2 is about Abraham. In verse 3, he says, I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. In other words, God said, I'm not only going to oversee your part in this story, but as this story unfolds and becomes a global story, I'm going to give you the assurance of my commitment to my promises so that the whole world will be measured in my estimation. This is God talking. The whole world will be measured in my estimation by how they relate to you. Wow. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. I was doing some reading today. I was doing some research for Truth Currents a couple of weeks down the road, and I got caught in a rabbit trail of current outbreaks of anti-Semitism in America. And I've seen the news stories. I know about the pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses and other things. Go into the depth of what's behind that. You know, you can sort of write off protests by college students because, honestly, none of them are as smart as they think they are. I mean, a college freshman that's had one semester of philosophy is the smartest person on the planet. And so you see this and you're just like, kids. But when you begin to really look into what's behind all of this, I guess I hadn't given it enough attention, but the sheer depth of hatred toward the Jews is really at a level that I've never seen in my lifetime. If you're keeping score, increased hatred for the Jews is a birth pang of the end times. And it's remarkable the kinds of things that are being written, and you know, even among so-called Christians, I found some stuff today, and the Jews, the modern day Jews are not the Jews of the Bible. They're really different, and the promises don't apply, and I just sort of made my head hurt. And all I could do is come back to the reality that God told Abraham, I'm going to measure my response to all the nations of the earth by their attitude toward you. If Genesis 12:3 is still in effect, and there's nothing in Scripture to imply that it's not, personally, I think we've discovered the reason that the United States of America plays no part in the book of Revelation. Because I think our willingness to accept this anti-Semitic mood that is sweeping our country, this is a biblical justification for God to take us out of the game and set us aside. I'm not suggesting that the United States will cease to exist, but I am suggesting that if we don't figure this out, we will cease to be relevant to the story of redemption. So here we go. Abraham was given the command, but then 2 verses of promises follow. And the writer of Hebrews, we come back to Hebrews 11. The writer of Hebrews looked at these verses in Genesis 12, and this is what he said. This is why Abraham is included. He said, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he left not knowing where he was going. Not knowing where he was going. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us There's a little bit at the end of chapter 11 in Genesis, but there's not a full detailed analysis of really how Abraham came to know the true God. I mean, we don't know that whole story. But there was something there, because God called him to stand in a place of truly remarkable significance. And Abraham, already this early in the story, had such rock solid faith that God was true, that his word, his promises could be trusted, that he literally left his land, his relatives, and his father's household to go to a place where he didn't know where he was going. Can you imagine packing your bag and somebody says, "Hey, where are you going?" Don't know. Well, how long have you been traveling? Not sure. Well, how you going to know when you get there? Well, I'm counting on the God that's directed me to tell me to stop. And that's exactly what happened. All right, let's look at the rest of this story. That confident obedience is followed by an eternal timetable. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. By faith, he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now this is fascinating, the language that's used here, because what the writer of Hebrews is telling us is that Abraham was actually living by divine promise, not by immediate gratification. I mean, we're going to see that, and when we jump back to Genesis, but Abraham is going to practice. He's going to practice endurance. He's going to develop even-temperedness. He's going to have the ability to handle success and failure, specifically because he has this eternal timetable. He is living in the present, in the physical world, but he's living in the expectation of something that hasn't happened yet. Look at these verses. By faith he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob. That word stranger is an important word. It means that he was living as somebody who didn't belong there. In other words, he was looking for a city whose foundation was built by God. In other words, Abraham didn't get to the land of Canaan and then find that he was disappointed because he didn't really find a home there. Abraham lived in tents the rest of his life. In this world's view, he was what we call a nomad. He lived here for a while, and then they packed up, and then they moved to another place, and they lived there for a while, and they packed up. He was a traveler. He was an alien, a stranger, an exile. He was never at home. When he left his father's house to follow God, he was never at home in this world again. But it says that didn't create for him a discontent. Why? Because he knew from the moment that he left that he was looking for a city that God was going to build. Well, what city is he talking about? Well, we know from a New Testament perspective, he's talking about the New Jerusalem. As far back as Genesis chapter 12, by faith, Abraham was following God with the expectation that one of these days, this broken down world, groaning under the weight of sin, is going to be remade, restored. It's going to be new. And there's going to be a city that God built, God's the architect for, and Abraham, that many centuries before us even, he was looking for that city. You see, the reason Abraham is in Hebrews chapter 11 It's because he is a model for us to quit being at home here. Say, well, we don't live in tents. Well, we kind of do. I mean, we don't live in canvas tents, but if we can define a tent as a temporary dwelling, let me tell you, the house you live in, as solid as you think it is, it's a temporary dwelling. It wasn't always there, and it's not always going to be there. We have a 4,500 square foot house right next door on this acreage that we've purchased as a church. And we just had a meeting this week where we began to contemplate the timetable for when we remove that house. It's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next month. But it's on the horizon because God has given us plans for that 10 acres, and that house is going to go. Now, I'm sure when that house was built, 4,500 square feet, luxury accommodation, somebody poured their hard-earned money into that house. But I'm telling you, we're going to live to see the day when that house doesn't exist anymore. By definition, it's temporary, as is all of our houses. So we have to have the mindset that there's only one house, and there's only one city that has eternal foundations. And if you want a city that has eternal foundations, you kind of need a divine architect. As many hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, as Abraham walked the earth, he was still looking for something that even for us is still in the future. That was faith. Now, it says here, let's go back. Let's go back to the story in Genesis. Flip back to Genesis chapter 12. Look at verse 5. Abraham took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and all their possessions which they had accumulated and the people which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanites were in the land at that time, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Let's talk about those verses. Something special occurs in your relationship with God when you obey him. You see, Abraham's faith produced the practical result of obedience. When you obey God, you come to know God better. This is the pattern that the Bible gives us. Obedience produces intimacy. Intimacy produces trust, which is, in a practical sense, faith. We think that if God would let us be intimate, then we would find it easier to obey. Again, that's not the biblical pattern. Obedience precedes intimacy. God doesn't give himself lightly to people who have not already decided that he's trustworthy and worthy of their obedience. Now, he gets to Canaan, and the writer of Genesis tells us something very interesting. Use your sanctified imagination and think about this. Abraham has been walking all the way from Ur of the Chaldees. I mean, he's left what would eventually one day become the land of Babylon. That was in the prophets, the Babylonians are sometimes called Chaldeans. That's the land that Abraham came from. He walks all the way, hundreds of miles, to get to the land of Canaan. He gets there, and lo and behold, there are Canaanites there. Now, I don't know what he thought before he arrived, but I wonder if he had an idea that there was this pristine, untouched place where God was going to take him, where a new nation would be established and blessed and expand and grow. And yet when he got there, the place is crawling with Canaanites. I mean, there are tribes, they have kings, they have their own cities. In Another interesting lesson, I think, that comes out of this. What would Abraham have done if he had realized at the beginning of the journey that there was going to be opposition living in the land that God was promising him as an inheritance? Think about this. I just had a conversation where we talked about what might happen in 2 years and whether we should do something today based on what might happen in 2 years. And this passage is what comes to my mind in that conversation, because here's the lesson. Never let the second step frighten you into not taking the first step. When Abraham got there, I suspect Canaan wasn't exactly what he was thinking it was going to be. I think it probably caught him off guard for a minute. But just for a minute, because we find out that when he gets there, it says that they came to the land of Canaan. He passed through the land as far as Shechem, the oak of Moreh. The Canaanites were in the land at that time. Verse 7. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. Okay, that's significant. That's why I think Abraham, not having doubts, but I think he was just caught off guard by it, because God makes an appearance where he reiterates the promise. It's not a new promise, but he says it again. I think that is God's sort of condescension to the weakness of his human servant, where Abraham's like, man, I don't know what I thought, but this is not what I expected. And God comes and says, listen, let me remind you of something. Nothing's changed since you left your old home. I'm going to give your descendants this land. You see, what God is saying is, leave the next step to me. We're going to unfold this, but I've got this covered. I know the beginning from the end. You just take each step as I direct you, and you don't worry about how the story is going to unfold. And look what happens. I will to your descendants I will give this land. And this is why he's in Hebrews chapter 11. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Let me tell you something. Abraham found circumstances that were different, I think, than he expected. But refusing to let the unknown of his second step stop him from taking the first step. God said, I want to remind you, I've made a promise. The promise is there. And God appears to answer a little bit of uncertainty in the mind of Abraham. And his immediate response was worship. He built an altar. Listen, anytime you have a word from God that requires a response, that response should involve worship. Abram was impelled to give a public testimony to God's mercy, so he built an altar. And here's the way it works. You obey God. He gives you a fresh experience of his presence. You worship. And guess what? Worship leads to the confidence to obey God in the next step. Why is it so important, the New Testament tells us, for us to come together and worship? Because we leave on Sunday morning better prepared to take the next steps for God than we were when we arrived that day. Obedience produces an experience of God which inspires worship, and worship creates obedience, which produces an experience with God, which inspires worship. And that, folks, is the cycle of the life we've been invited to live. Well, he had an eternal timetable. Even though there were Canaanites in the land, he refused to let the visible circumstances in his mind take away the certainty of the eternal plan that he had accepted, that he believed was from God. Now, back to Hebrews 11. In the next section of Hebrews 11, we have what I've called active waiting. Look at verses 11 and 12. It says, by faith, we're going to turn our attention to Sarah. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Isn't that interesting? Sarah, he acknowledges Sarah was way past childbearing years. For her to give birth to a child was clearly evidence of something supernatural. But what happened is she was willing to accept the promise because the one who made the promise was trustworthy. Now, listen to this. This is my favorite part. Therefore, verse 12, even from one man, I love this phrase. Therefore, from one man, and one who was as good as dead at that, there were born descendants who were just as the stars of heaven in number and as innumerable grains of sand along the seashore. You know, again, my sanctified imagination is not always sanctified. But I know the book of Hebrews was written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But I'm thinking when the book of Hebrews hit the bookshelf, you know, the front window of the heavenly bookstore, and everybody was picking up a copy and reading Hebrews for the first time, in my mind, Abraham reads Hebrews and goes, as good as dead? Come on. I was just in the prime of life. I was in the bloom of young manhood. No, you were old. You were old. But you see, that's part of the supernatural part of the story. God took a man who was as good as dead and a woman way past the years of conception, and he said, let me show you what I can do. What did God need to create the nation of Israel? He didn't need a strong, strapping young buck. He didn't need a 25-year-old beauty queen. He needed a husband and a wife who would live, they would stake their lives on the trustworthiness of the promises of God. If we could capture that faith is not wishing really hard for God to do something, but faith is taking God at His word with complete confidence, there's no telling what we could do. I remember the story of the two kids, and they were comparing the pennies in their hand. And one said, I've got 10 pennies. The other one said, I have 5 pennies. And they opened up their hands, and they both had 5 pennies. And one said, I thought you said you had 10 pennies. And she said, well, my dad told me that tonight when he gets home, he's going to give me 5 pennies, so I have 10 pennies. See, Dad's promise was trustworthy, and she could live as though she had those 10 pennies already in her hands. That's the faith that put Abraham and Sarah in Hebrews chapter 11. Well, let's go back. Let's pick up that part of the story in Genesis. Go back to Genesis. Turn to chapter 13. Now, we're going to skip the rest of chapter 12, but let me just so you know I'm not afraid of it. The rest of chapter 12 is where Abraham shows us that despite the great faith that he has, that pleased God, he's still not yet a perfect person. Because the rest of chapter 12 is where he goes to Egypt, passes his wife off as his sister because he's afraid of what's going to happen if he tells people that it's his wife. She's so beautiful that he's afraid they're going to kill him so they can take his wife. So he manipulates the circumstances, and it doesn't turn out well for him. But it's a lesson learned. Now, that's thrown in just so that we don't put Abraham on such a high pedestal that we think that he's that he doesn't have his own flaws. He does. But I want you to see that he learns some lessons about manipulating his circumstances, because when we get to chapter 13, look at, we're going to start with verse 5. Verse 5 says, "Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents." All right? He followed him from home. They both have their own households, but they have traveled as nomads together, and they each have their own possessions. Verse 6, "And the land could not support both of them while living together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time." Again, why that little mention right there? I think it's a reminder that as we get into a little bit of a spat between Abram and Lot, the unbelieving world is watching. All right, we're going to come back to that. Verse 8. "So Abram said to Lot, 'Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are relatives. Is the entire land not before you? Please separate from me. If you choose the left, then I'll go to the right. If you choose the right, then I'll go to the left.' Lot raised his eyes and saw all the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt going toward Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the vicinity of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward, so they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the vicinity of the Jordan and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord." Okay, there's more to that story, but let's pick up right there. With the lesson that he learned in Egypt still fresh in his mind, Abram decides in this situation to not try and manipulate the circumstances. He's figured out that if you wait and trust, that God will work things out. He avoided the natural response of claiming all the best land because of the divine promise. In other words, Abraham could have said, "Listen, I'm the one God called to come here. You came along with me, but I'm the one with the promise. And so the best land, the well-watered land, that should be for me." But that's not what he did. He offers Lot the choice, partly because I think it was an unseemly conflict. I mean, it's bad enough for family to disagree, but to fall out, especially over material things, in the presence of the ungodly observers of the land would have made it even worse. If I could tell you the stories of families that I have seen split down the middle over the division of mama's estate, or the sale of the family business, or the hurt feelings that go with who gets what. Here Abraham says, he makes what on the surface looks like kind of a risky offer. He says, "You choose. I'll take whatever you don't want." But here's where faith comes in. Abraham believed God so completely that he knew even by invitation, Lot could never take away what God had promised to Abraham. Lot didn't have Abraham's spiritual stature. He didn't have his maturity. But Abraham was willing to surrender his personal rights because he believed that God's plans could never be thwarted. He was the senior family member, and he had the right to claim the land, but he believed in God. I think that's why we have the story of Egypt, because coming immediately off of that story, Abraham has in the front of his brain, don't try and manipulate this to your advantage. God said he has a plan. He's going to make me a mighty nation. He's going to bless me, and he's going to give me a great name. Those promises are still in his mind. And then the reminder was, oh, by the way, remember, your descendants are going to have all of this. See, here we're back to that eternal timetable. Lot, take whatever you want, because one of these days, my descendants, they're going to have all of it. This all belongs to me. Daddy promised me pennies. I don't have them in my hand yet, but the promise is good. All right, now, here we go. Lot makes an undiscerning choice, and I think there's almost an Easter egg here in the sense that there's a nod to something that's coming when it says the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord. That's just a hint. To quote the medieval knight in Raiders of the Lost Ark, you could look at Lot and say he chose poorly. Abram was at risk, but not really, because he trusted in God. All right, back to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11. A sacrificial trust. Look at verses 17 through 19. By faith. Now, I love that this writer starts every sentence by faith, by faith, by faith. He wants us to not miss the point of the chapter. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and the one who had received the promises was offering up his only son. It was he to whom it was said, through Isaac your descendant shall be named. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Okay, let's pause and think about that for a minute. Here's the story. We've already said, based on Abraham, a man who's as good as dead, and Sarah, who was way past her years for conception, they had a son. His son was named Isaac. In Genesis chapter 22, the most unthinkable demand is made. Abraham, take your boy. Yeah, that one, the only one, the one that I gave you. Take him to the top of Mount Moriah, which, by the way, Mount Moriah in the Old Testament, eventually generations will pass. Did you realize that Mount Moriah in Genesis chapter 22 is the mountain upon which the temple was built in Jerusalem? Take him up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. Excuse me? Did you say sacrifice him, like take a knife and cut him open and prepare him and lay him on an altar and burn him up? Take him up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine that scene. The gut-wrenching obedience to get all the supplies needed for a sacrifice. Put him on a donkey. Take Isaac and say, we're going to go for a trip. Plan for a couple of days. We're going to go to the top of that mountain over there. We're going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Now, sometimes we think that Isaac was just a little toddler at that point. He was probably a teenager. That's why he was smart enough about halfway up the mountain to go, hey, Dad, you said we're going up to the top of the mountain to sacrifice to the Lord, but, we've done this sacrifice thing before, and I see everything we need here. We've got the oil, and we've got the wood, and, we have everything that we need, but we don't have a sacrifice. Well, what's the deal here? And in an act of faith, remember what Abraham said? The Lord will provide, son. Now, I wonder, I think it's wrong to think that Abraham was just skipping his way up the mountain because he had such faith. I think his faith at this point is a kind of dogged faith that says, I will believe, I will believe, I will believe. God is trustworthy. God told me. He's reviewing every promise that God's ever given him. And he's reliving every one of those years to that young teenage boy's life and the joy that has come from having that son. And every time he just takes another step, he just climbs that mountain. And he gets there to the top of the mountain. prepares the sacrifice. I wonder how he explained it to Isaac. Son, God told me to do this. And I can't tell you how this is going to unfold, except I can tell you this. Even if he has to do it in order to keep his promises, he can bring you back from the dead. Now understand, at this point in Old Testament history, there is not a well-developed doctrine of the afterlife. There is at most this belief that God is eternal and his relationship with his people must be eternal. But there wasn't the kind of grasp of the idea of resurrection that we have on this side of Jesus. I'm getting a little loud again, fellas. And yet, this man of faith, without great theological training, climbing that mountain, he'd come to this conclusion. God's purpose can't possibly be frustrated because God made a promise. So if he's telling me to do this, there must be a way for the promise to be fulfilled, even if this child dies. What incredible insight. How could he think those things? Because by faith, he was intimate with the nature of God. Well, you remember the story. Prepares the altar, and just as he's about to make that knife plunge, Abraham, wait! And what was over here? Horns trapped in the brush, but a sacrifice. God will provide. But you see, here's what the type is. On that very mountain, in generations to come, there would be a temple. And from that temple, there would be a moment where God himself would allow himself to be put on a cross. And in the death of that Son of God, the veil of that temple torn from top to bottom, so that we wouldn't have to pay the penalty for our sin, because God will provide a sacrifice. Man, isn't it cool how the whole Bible fits together? I mean, how can you not believe that there's a single author behind the entire collection of books, because every piece fits together? Here was the story of Abraham living by faith in what was certainly the most difficult moment of faith of his life. Well, the story ends this way. Let's go back to chapter 23 of Genesis. That was chapter 22, the story on Mount Moriah. But go to chapter 23. I just want to read a couple of verses here. In chapter 23, beginning in the first verse, it says, Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham arose from mourning before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a foreign resident among you. Give me a burial site among you so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Well, the chapter goes on, and they cut a deal, and he buys a cave, the cave of Machpelah, and that's where he buries Sarah. The reason why I think this is important is because, first of all, we find that following God does not guarantee an absence of grief. Sarah died, and Abraham grieved. They had walked together. They had been husband and wife, but more than that, they had been soldiers for the king. Faithful, both of them by name, in Hebrews chapter 11. Why are we given the details that were given about buying that cave where she could be buried? Because it's the perfect conclusion to the story of a man of faith named Abraham, and this is it. For all the promises that God gave him, I'm going to give you this land. Your descendants will have all of this. You remember earlier, God told him to walk the breadth and the width of the land. And God said, walk as far that way as you can, walk as far that way as you can, walk as far this way and that way. I'm going to give you all of it. It's going to belong to your people. But in his own lifetime, the only land in Canaan Abraham ever actually owned was the burial plot for his wife. You think Abraham ever thought, man, if I had known this whole story before I started, I don't know if I'd have left. I mean, he was probably a man of some means. I mean, he didn't leave Haran with no possessions. He had a lot already. He must have been a man of some means. He must have been living in a city where he was recognized as somebody. You think he ever looked at that story and felt like he'd been cheated? Lived the rest of his life in a tent? Buried his wife in a little cave? It was the only thing he ever actually owned. No, I tell you, he never felt like he was cheated because he never lived by visible circumstances. He always lived in the reality of the promises of God. Faith, simply put, faith is acting as though the promises of God are true, whether you can see them or not. When He has given us His word, you can literally stake your life on it. And Abraham is included in Hebrews chapter 11 because literally he said, I trust God more than I trust anything. And that, folks, is a hero of the faith. Father, thank you so much for your word. The story of Abraham is nothing short of remarkable. It is, from start to finish, a story of your faithfulness above all else. And Lord, we find here such an encouragement to just not judge eternity by what we see, but rather to judge what we see by eternity. Let us be a people of faith like that. Let our hearts be completely yours. As you search to and fro across the earth, find here a people of faith named Evergreen. This is our prayer, Lord, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.